Hello, my name is Mariah Hoy, and I'm a health program specialist in the Office of Research Quality at NINDS, or the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. And today I'm going to be giving an overview of the NINDS Rigor Champions Prize. The NINDS Office of Research Quality promotes robust, high-quality scientific research by increasing attention to the principles of rigorous research and transparent reporting. And if you'd like to learn more, I've included our QR code as well as a shortened link to our website. What do we mean by rigor and transparency practices? To illustrate, I'll walk through examples of rigor and transparency practices along the research lifecycle. In the first stage, you're evaluating existing evidence and generating hypotheses. And then in the second stage, you move on to planning and experimental design. And examples of rigor and transparency practices in this phase would be things like calculating sample size to make sure that your experiments are adequately powered, having plans for blinding or masking of experimenters, as well as plans for randomization of samples. And then finally, things like defining inclusion and exclusion criteria. When you move into the conducting experiments and collecting data phase, this is when you would follow through on those plans for blinding or masking of experimenters, randomizing your samples, and then also using those predetermined inclusion and exclusion criteria for handling outliers. In the analysis and interpretation phase, you're making inferences from data, making sure that you're using the appropriate statistical tests, and then preventing p-hacking and harking, or hypothesizing after results are known. And then when you move into the publishing and reporting phase, you want to make sure that you're doing this in a transparent way, that you're also displaying data transparently, and then publishing null results to help reduce publication bias. So now, after going through some rigor and transparency practices along the research lifecycle, when we start a new line of inquiry and evaluate the quality of the existing evidence, it should be on the basis of adherence to those rigor and transparency practices. Were prior experiments more exploratory and preliminary, or were they confirmatory? In which case, these practices, such as blinding or masking of experimenters and randomizing samples, should really have been employed. And if you'd like to see more examples of rigor and transparency practices, you can go to this shortened link. The problem is that the current incentive structure is not necessarily aligned with what we should value. And what we should value is high quality research, which is rooted in those rigor and transparency practices, such as transparent reporting, taking measures to reduce bias, such as blinding or masking of experimenters, using appropriate data handling, and then publishing both positive as well as negative or null results. And yet, how we evaluate research and researchers is largely based on bibliometrics. So things like the number of publications that an investigator has, or the impact factor of the journals in which those articles are published, or the amount of grant funding or grant support that an investigator has, or their H-index, or the number of citations that have been garnered by those publications. And so there's really this discordance between what we should value and how we evaluate. Realigning the incentives with our values ultimately requires culture change. But unfortunately, this misalignment is present across all sectors of the scientific ecosystem. And so no one group can change the culture in isolation. Following a workshop in 2018, we and attendees proposed establishing communities of rigor champions across the various sectors of the scientific ecosystem to lead grassroots efforts to change the culture and enhance attention to rigor and transparency. And you're welcome to read more in our eLife 2020 paper. What does it mean to be a rigor champion? We define a rigor champion as someone from any career stage or scientific sector who is driving awareness of or improvements in rigorous research practices or transparent reporting, regardless of how big or small the effort. Rigor champions can come from all career stages and sectors, including undergraduates and graduate students, staff scientists, educators, librarians, core facility managers, and more. In 2022, we hosted a workshop to bring together rigor champions and discuss how we could better catalyze communities and also overcome barriers to changing the culture of science. And if you're interested in learning more, I've posted a shortened link to the video cast there. One of the recommendations stemming from the workshop was really the need for incentives and rewards for promoting research quality and across all types of rigor champions, not just those who are typically eligible for grants. And thus, we had to find creative mechanisms to reward rigor champions across all sectors of the scientific ecosystem. And ultimately, this led to the development of the NINDS Rigor Champions Prize, the goals of which are really threefold. One, to identify rigor champions who are really exemplars of promoting enhanced research rigor and transparency practices beyond their normal job duties. Secondly, to recognize and reward these champions for their efforts. And then thirdly, to raise awareness of these efforts more broadly, which, hopefully by increasing awarenesses of these practices, we will further reinforce them and also bolster the community around them. So a challenge is actually quite distinct from a typical grant mechanism. Grants are largely awarded for future activities, so things that you're proposing to do. They're awarded to institutions, and they're mostly limited to principal investigators or people of equivalent status. Grants are reviewed by panels of scientists from the community, and the funds are restricted for research use. In the case of this challenge, you're being awarded for past activities, so things that you've already done. This challenge is open to individuals and small teams of up to 5 individuals, as well as the general public. So importantly, rigor champions from all of the various sectors of the scientific ecosystem. This challenge will be reviewed by federal employees with the necessary expertise. And importantly, the monetary awards are unrestricted. So if you win the Rigor Champions prize, you can use the money at your discretion. Another key difference is that in the case of this challenge, the submission is actually much shorter than your typical grant. We're really asking for 3 500-word essays, and I'll go into more detail later on in the presentation. So if you're interested in learning more about the challenge, the NINDS Rigor Champions Prize is hosted on challenge.gov. I posted the link here on the slide, but it's also in the description of the video. When you come to the webpage, you'll see various tabs with specific information. So there's an overview tab, just giving a detailed description of the challenge, some examples of responsive and non-responsive activities. There's also a timeline tab with all of the key dates. Importantly, submissions do close on August 15th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. There's also a prizes tab. In the case of this challenge, up to 5 awards of $10,000 each will be made. There's a rules tab outlining all of the eligibility requirements and participation rules. There's also a judging tab to go over the evaluation criteria. There's also a how to enter tab with details on what to include in your submission and how to enter. And then there are also resources, FAQs, and a contact form. So I'm going to provide an overview of the information in each of these tabs, but I really highly encourage potential participants to read the rules and eligibility criteria in full, and then see that how to enter tab for details on what to include in your submission. So timeline and key dates, just a reminder, the submission deadline is August 15th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So if you're in a different time zone, please mark that down or make a mental note. Following the submission close, we'll enter into a pre-screening and initial review phase, and then move on to judging and final selection, with winners being announced by November 10th. I'm going to give a brief overview of the eligibility criteria and the participation rules. This challenge is open to individuals and small teams of up to 5 individuals who are at least 18 years old. To be eligible for a monetary award, entries must be submitted by a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, whether as an individual or as a team lead. So teams must designate an eligible team lead, and they will receive the cash prize in full if selected. So the rest of the composition of your team doesn't really matter, but if you'd like to be eligible for a monetary award, the team lead must be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. Entries submitted by a non-U.S. citizen or a non-permanent resident, again, whether as an individual or as a team lead, may be recognized with a non-monetary honorable mention. Federal employees are not eligible, and then only one entry per participant is allowed. So again, whether submitting as an individual or as part of a team. All of the eligibility requirements and participation rules are in that rules tab, and I highly encourage you to read that in full. So once you've decided you want to enter the NINDS Rigor Champions Prize Challenge, you can submit via the challenge.gov portal by clicking on Apply for this challenge. You'll have to create a login and then provide a title and a brief description. And then we are asking for a single combined PDF titled Submission with 3 sections that can be 500 words each. So there will be an essay on your championship and commitment to the activity you're describing, the significance of the activity as it relates to rigor and transparency, as well as the impact that this activity has had on the broader community. And I'll describe each of those in more detail on the next slide. We're also asking for a completed and signed participant registration and consent form. So if you're submitting as a team, you can submit one form, but all team members need to complete and sign the form. And then finally, there is an optional PDF entitled Other, which can include text, hyperlinks, or really any other material evidence of the activities described in the submission. This is, however, limited to 1 page, single-spaced, with a minimum font size of 11. So submissions will be evaluated on the following criteria. So first, this championship and commitment essay. The participant or team will be judged based on the level of grassroots organizing involved, the commitment of time and effort to the activity, and the level of perseverance required to ensure success of the activity. Submissions will also be evaluated based on the significance, so the importance of the rigor and transparency problem being addressed, its relevance to neuroscience and the broader community, the implementation approaches, the relevance of those approaches, and then how easily the activity could be scaled to other scientific groups. And then finally, submissions will be evaluated based on impact. So how successfully did the activity increase awareness of and/or change culture and behavior related to rigor and transparency? How widely these changes were observed or implemented, the level of community buy-in for the activity, and then how likely the activity is to be sustained in the long term. So really critical to this challenge is evidence of changing the culture around rigorous research practices and not simply employing rigorous research practices. So you don't have to change the world, but your activity does have to go beyond you and your own experiment. Review and judging will be broken down into 2 phases. The first phase will be pre-screening and initial review. Only complete and eligible submissions will move forward to review. And then each submission will be reviewed by at least 2 federal staff. High-scoring submissions will move on into a judging and final selection phase. At this stage, staff might reach out to participants and team leads for references, basically individuals who can verify the content of the submission. And then again, winners will be announced by November 10th, 2023. So what are we looking for? I'm going to go over some examples of responsive and non-responsive activities. All of these are included in the overview tab. In terms of responsive activities, one example would be seminar series or journal clubs really focused on discussing principles of rigorous research and transparent reporting. Also, the creation of new educational materials focused on enhancing attention to rigor and transparency. Campaigns to reform research assessment, so either at the graduate school level or tenure and promotion criteria, basically anything that shifts the focus of research assessment to actual research quality. And then things like awards for publications of, null results or replication efforts. Examples of non-responsive activities would include activities that are really focused outside the broader scope of rigor and transparency practices. So, specific techniques that are really, not relevant to the broader community. Activities which focus on researcher integrity, so things like ethics or misconduct, would also not be responsive to this challenge. Activities that are already required by NIH policies, such as responsible conduct of research training, etc., would also not be responsive to this challenge. And then finally, simply employing rigorous research practices, you and your own experiments would not be responsive. There does need to be this element of culture change. So I highly encourage you to apply. We really want to recognize rigor champions. So again, here is the challenge webpage, and the link is in the description. Just as a reminder, these are due August 15th, 2023 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Now moving into some frequently asked questions. This one pertains to eligibility. I'm not technically a scientist or a researcher. Am I eligible? Yes. Anyone who is championing activities that promote enhanced attention to rigor and transparency are encouraged to apply. We recognize that many of these individuals are university staff, such as librarians or administrators, and they might not be trained or practicing scientists, and that's fine. Am I eligible to apply if I have received prior federal funding for the activity that would be described in my submission? So this refers to a participation rule about federal funding. As long as federal funds are not used to develop the submission itself, that being the PDF document detailing the activity or other required documentation for challenge.gov, then you may submit an entry, assuming that all of the other eligibility requirements are met. However, it should be noted that as part of the championship and commitment essay, we ask participants to describe any resources or support that they received for the activity. So any financial support, federal or otherwise, should be described there. In terms of the submission content, what activities or interventions are you looking for? What is meant by culture change? Any activity that brings attention to rigor and transparency that's widely applicable to neuroscience and biomedical research is responsive. Critical to this challenge is evidence of culture change, which really just refers to improved behaviors or even attitudes towards scientific rigor and transparency practices, and this can happen on a small or a large scale. What kinds of outcomes should I report? Outcomes should be reported that provide evidence of the activity and any culture change related to the activity. For example, one could describe behavior or attitude changes associated with the activity via surveys, the number of participants in the program, levels of behavioral implementation, or even updated policy handbooks. Does the activity described in my submission have to relate directly to neuroscience research? The implemented activity and the targeted rigorous or transparent research practices should be applicable to neuroscience research relevant to the NINDS mission. That being said, activities do not have to be implemented directly in a neuroscience setting. The applicability to neuroscience should be described in the significance essay. If I was involved in more than one activity, should I describe all the activities? Because the essays are limited to 500 words, we would really advise participants to focus on one main activity that led to enhanced awareness or practice of research rigor and transparency and culture change. If space allows, other activities can be mentioned. How widely should the activity be implemented? Is it okay to be within a single program or department? It is acceptable for an activity to be implemented within a single program or department. However, activities will be judged on impact as described under the Judging tab. What can I include in the other PDF? The other PDF can include text, hyperlinks, or images that provide direct evidence of the activities described in the submission. For example, you can provide a list of literature cited, links to media articles about the implementation efforts and outcomes of the activity, links to or direct inclusion of evaluation instruments, images, graphs, or other data visualizations, and really any other material evidence of the activities and outcomes described in the submission. This other PDF is not meant as a space to describe new activities not described in the submission, so it shouldn't be used as a way to get around the word limits of the submission essays. Will early career participants be evaluated the same as more established or senior participants? Although early career and more established participants will be reviewed together under the same evaluation criteria, a range of considerations are included in the judging criteria to help distinguish between rigor champions who put more grassroots efforts in and may have had few resources from those who experienced fewer barriers and may have had more resources. What if I want to change my submission? What should I do? Submissions can be modified through challenge.gov until the submission deadline. The submission will need to be resubmitted through the submission portal, but it will keep the same submission number. But after the deadline, no changes can be made. Who can I ask about eligibility, logistics, or whether my submission fits the prize? You can submit questions using the contact form on the Challenge website, and we will provide feedback. I just ask that you allow sufficient time to receive a response. And then finally, where can I learn more about the prize and the office? So again, here's the link to the Challenge website. It's also posted in the video description. And if you'd like to learn more about the Office of Research Quality, I've reposted that shortened link as well as the QR code to our webpage. You can also follow us on Twitter or X at NINDS4Rigor. This is a great way to learn more about the office, rigor and transparency practices, as well as new initiatives. Thank you.